and this is a grant that will fall under the Victim Services Unit. And we'll talk more about that later during the presentation. Please try to remember to keep yourself muted. We'll have time for questions and answer session at the end of today's presentation, but you can put questions in the chat box at any time. And please take a moment right now to locate that chat box if you haven't located it already. And if you, this isn't mandatory training, so you don't have to sign in, but if you would sign in, that would really help us know who is interested in maybe thinking about applying for the grant. Thank you. So today's agenda, we're going to talk about the Victim Services Unit and our roles, an overview of the Family Violence Prevention and Service Program funding, definition, the Notice of Funding Opportunity details, completing the application, scope of work, and budget narrative are going to be focuses on that because those are some of the sections we see people have more difficulties with. We're going to go over application tips and the evaluation process, and then the post-award requirements. So the Victim Service Unit consists of 4 employees right now. Many of you probably know Erica Pond. She's our manager and handles high-level items and oversight of programs. I don't believe Erica's on, so I'm not going to let her introduce herself. Then you have me, and I oversee the program and work with the whole unit to get tasks divided and accomplished. Additionally, I will be doing our federal reporting on our grants. I'm relatively new to the unit. I started at the very end of June, but I have been with the state of Nevada for the last 8 years in various positions, including Medicaid and Northern Nevada Adult Mental Health. So I have some experience with a lot of the agencies, as NAMS works with a lot of the agencies and case management-wise. Jean is our GPA, and you will be interacting with her most. So GPA is Grants and Project Analyst. She'll be able to answer most of your questions you have about the grant, and she can research or escalate the question if she doesn't know the answer. And I'll let her introduce herself and talk a little bit more right now.
Thanks, Julie. Hi, everybody. I'm Jean Booth. You guys have probably been pretty familiar with me over the past couple of years. I've been with DCFS GMU unit for about a little over 2 years now. Mostly focused on VOCA, but I am quite familiar with FVPSA and the other awards that we have. Always happy to help you guys. My background is healthcare. Love working with victim services and love seeing how we're growing and changing and making things better. So I'm going to go ahead and let it go back to Julie so that we can get this training over and you guys can enjoy the rest of your evening. Thanks.
And then last but not least in our unit is Tracy. And Tracy is our management analyst. And so she processes all the requests for reimbursements or RFRs. And she's not on the call right now because she's busy processing all those RFRs as quickly as possible so people can get reimbursed. But she is who will contact you if you're missing any documentation on a request for funds or if there's any fiscal type questions on anything that has been filed. So FVPSA. FVPSA is administered by the Administration for Children and Families, or ACS, and the Family and Youth Services Bureau, or FYSB, because we have to have acronyms for everything. That is the part of the ACS that administers the fund. And it's a primary federal resource dedicated to the provision of domestic violence shelters, supportive services, and related programming for victims of domestic and dating violence and their dependents. And so it started in 1984. So it's been around for a little less than 40 years. And it's regulated by 42 USC 10401 through 10413. And that's the highest level authority, and it preempts state laws if there are a conflict. And then the next level of authority on it is the Health and Human Services, or HHS, too many acronyms, regulation, which is mostly covers the codified version of the Office of Management and Budget, or OMB circulars, or 45 CFR. 75. And so, which is one of their guiding documents, which regulates the uniform administration requirement of cost principles and audit requirements for health and human services awards. And then there's 45 CFR 1370, which provides clarification on existing guidance and best practices from the FVPSA office. So you might be asking, why do you need to know this? Well, these are the rules that we use when determining what is allowable for the grant and when monitoring the agencies that we provide subgrants to. And I provided links. All of those are links, and I think they should still work in the PDF, but if they don't and you really want the links, you can reach out to us. And that will help you if you're wondering if the grant will cover something specific. You can always read the regulations that say whether it's a coverable service or not. That's what we go through. But yeah, federal regulations are super fun to read. So there they are for anybody who's really interested. So this FVPSA has two statutory purposes. One is funding to the state, and the other is national funding. And so funding to the state covers assistance, assist states and tribes in their efforts to prevent DV and dating violence, provides immediate shelter and supportive services for victims of DV and their dependents, and provides specialized services for abused parents and their children. So that's the funding that we get and we sub-award for this notification. And we'll go into details of the opportunity for funding. And then the national funding, which we don't get, that the federal government distributes contracts for, is to provide that national domestic violence hotline and to provide technical assistance and training related to DV and DV programs to states, tribes, public agencies, community-based programs, and the public. So that funding we don't see, but that is something that's in that FVPSA provision. So some facts about FVPSA. It's a formula grant that assists states and territories to fund more than 1,600 local, public, and nonprofit and faith-based organizations across the nation. And it provides victims and families of domestic violence and dating violence and their children with shelter, safety planning, crisis counseling, information and referrals, legal advocacy, and additional supportive services related to assistance. The requirements for it. Direct payments to any victim or domestic violence, victim or dependent of a victim are not allowed. So you can't use the funds to write checks to people who are victimized. You can pay for shelter, motel rooms, services for them, but you can't directly give them funding from it. Services must be voluntary and have no conditions imposed upon the receipt of emergency shelter. Subrecipients may not apply inappropriate screening mechanisms such as criminal background checks or sobriety requirements for victims to obtain shelter services. So I know that was a big thing in the past. So if a shelter does have those requirements, they wouldn't be able to be funded by FVPSA. Income eligibility standards may not be applied to individuals receiving assistance with the service. So that's another requirement. Written procedures must be present or be developed within 30 days of the award to ensure confidentiality of records pertaining to persons receiving assistance or services. No person shall, on the ground of actual or perceived gender, including gender identity, be excluded from participation in or denied benefits of or be subject to discrimination under any program or activity funded in whole or in part by FVPSA. So you can't discriminate based on gender. So if you offer services to women, you also have to offer that to men or people who are transgendered. Subrecipients must provide comparable services to victims regardless of actual or perceived gender. So the services, you have to offer them and they have to be comparable. So that's big definition, you can read that. So we're going to go into definitions because the definitions are in the Notice of Funding Opportunity, and it's important for us to understand what FVPSA defines these things as because many people have different definitions of the same kind of language. So it's important that we understand what FVPSA and the federal agency defines those as. So dating violence is defined as violence committed by a person who is or has been in a social relationship of a romantic or intimate nature with the victim, and where the existence of such a relationship shall be determined based on the consideration of the following factors: the length of the relationship, the type of the relationship, and the frequency of interaction between the person involved in the relationship. Domestic violence is defined as felony or misdemeanor crimes of violence committed by a former spouse or intimate partner of the victim, by a person with whom the victim shares a child in common, by a person who is cohabitating with the or has cohabitated with the victim or spouse or intimate partner, by a person similarly situated to the spouse of a victim, or by any other person against an adult or youth victim who is protected from that person's act under the domestic or family violence of the jurisdiction. Whew. Okay. Family violence is defined as any act or threatened act of violence, including forceful detention of an individual which results or threatens to result in physical injury, and is committed by a person against another individual, including an elderly person, to whom such person is or was related by blood or marriage, or otherwise legally related to, or with whom such person is or was lawfully residing. Shelter is defined as provision of temporary refuge and related assistance, including safe homes, shelters, meals, and related assistance to victims of family violence and their dependents. Related assistance is the provision of direct assistance to victims of family violence and their dependents for the purpose of preventing further violence, helping such victims to gain access to civil or criminal courts or other community services, facilitating the efforts of such victims to make decisions concerning their lives in the interest of safety, and assisting such victims in healing from the effects of their violence. So it's important to know these definitions, because when you apply, there's different funding amounts, and we'll talk about that later based on what type of services you're providing. Related assistance shall include prevention services such as outreach and prevention services for victims and their children, employment training, parenting and other educational services for victims and their children, preventative health services within domestic violence programs, including nutrition, disease prevention, exercise, and prevention of substance abuse, domestic violence, prevention programs for school-aged children, family violence, public awareness campaigns, and violence prevention counseling services to abusers. Counseling with respect to family violence, counseling by peer individuals or in groups, and referral to community social services. Transportation, technical assistance with respect to obtaining financial assistance under federal and state programs, and referrals for appropriate healthcare services, including alcohol and drug abuse treatment, which shall not include reimbursement for any healthcare services. So if you're connected with a clinic that also provides healthcare services, you cannot bill FVPSA for those healthcare services. Counseling is the bullet 2, so that is excluded from being considered healthcare services, even though I know as mental health and physical health become more treated collaboratively as a whole person view, that can kind of get a little blurred. Legal advocacy to provide victims with information and assistance through the civil and criminal courts and legal assistance, or children's counseling and supportive services and child care services for children who are victims of family violence or dependents of such victims. So the details for our Notice of Funding Opportunity, or NOFO, are that it's a competitive application, and funds awarded will begin July 1st, 2020. So at the beginning of the state fiscal year, which was July 1st, and will expire on September 30th, 2021. Now, it used to go through June 30th. We have decided to make this award go through the end of September of 2021. And then the next year, the award will start October 1st and go through September 30th, 2021. So it will no longer be retroactive to July after this year. We're trying to get the award to align with the federal fiscal year, and also align it with when we find out about the funding and are able to announce it and award it, so that people aren't hoping on funds that they have not yet been awarded. So that's our hope for the future. So if you are an applicant that applies each year, please keep in mind that this is the last year that it will be retroactively awarded to July 1st, 2020. So the award has a match or cost sharing requirement of 20% of the total FVPSA project. So that can be confusing to people because you'll take your award and multiply it by 20%, and that will give you a totally different answer. So the total award is the whole award, the match plus the award. And so that's going to be 20% of that whole amount. So to get that, you take the award amount and divide it by 80% or 0.80, and then multiply by 20% or 0.2, and that'll get you what the match should be. And I'll show you that when we talk about the budget details on the budget narrative, so that you can make sure that the budget you provide has an accurate match. Competitive applications, I forgot to mention this, means that all applications will be subject to a review with a confidential review committee. And we'll talk about that details on what will be reviewed later on in the presentation. And match is federally regulated and written into the statute. And as such, there's not the ability to offer match waivers on this grant as there was for the Victims of Crime Act, or VOCA grant this year. So I know that the FVPSA CARES, or the additional FVPSA award that came out for COVID, had the ability to have a match waiver or no match, and the VOCA had a match waiver. So unfortunately, with this FVPSA grant here, you will need to be able to provide the full 20% match. There won't be a waiver. So Nevada FVPSA NOFO details. The funding amount will be $1,258,705. And 74% of that, and you can see the percentages breakdown, will be for immediate shelter and supportive services. So it's regulated federally that at least 70% goes to that, and we've decided in our allocation to make it 74% to go to immediate shelters and supportive services, and then 26% will go to supportive services and preventative services. Funding will be distributed to support organizations that have their primary purpose, the operation of shelters for victims of family violence, domestic violence, and dating violence, and their dependents. And preference will be given to culturally specific populations and underserved populations. I already talked a little about the funding year. So to be eligible, eligible applicants are nonprofits or faith-based organizations, and supports programs and projects within the state to prevent incidents of family, domestic, and dating violence, and to provide immediate shelter and related assistance to victims of family violence and their dependents. So you must have a data universal numbering system, or DUNS number. And if you don't have a DUNS number, the process to obtain one is free and outlined in the Notice of Funding Opportunity. So if you don't have one, please look in the Notice of Funding Opportunity to find out how to obtain one. It must be civil rights compliant, and civil rights compliant means all recipients of federal funds are required to comply with non-discrimination requirements contained in various federal laws. In the event that a court or administration agency makes a finding of discrimination on grounds of race, color, religion, national origin, gender, disability, or age against the recipient of funds after due process hearing, the recipient must agree to forward a copy of the findings of the Office of Civil Rights of the Department of Justice Office of Justice Program. Also, if you are awarded the grant, you will be expected to complete the online civil rights training. National origin discrimination includes discrimination on the basis of limited English proficiency. To ensure compliance with the Title 6 of the Civil Rights Act and the Omnibus Crime Control and Safe Streets Act, grant recipients are required to take reasonable steps to ensure that limited English proficient persons have meaningful access to their programs. Meaningful access may entail providing language assistance services, including interpretation and translation services where necessary. Applicants are encouraged to consider the need for language services, both for language or limited English proficient persons served or encountered both in developing their proposals and budgets and conducting their programs and activities. Reasonable costs associated with providing meaningful access for LEP individuals are considered allowable costs for the program. So if you are building a program that you want to have be more accessible, you can put those costs into your grant proposal. Confidentiality requirements. Subrecipients are prohibited from the following: disclosing any personally identifying information collected in connection with services requested through the subrecipient's program, revealing any personally identifying information without informed, reasonably time-limited consent by the person about whom the information is sought, and require an adult, youth, or child victim of the family, domestic, or dating violence to provide a consent to release his or her personally identifying information as a condition of eligibility for the service provided by the subrecipient. So you can't force someone to sign a consent in order to get services. Award timeline. So this is our plan. Is the grant was announced last Friday. We're having the webinar today. And by the end of next week, we should have the questions and answers we've received via email and this webinar and the recording of this webinar posted on our DCFS Grants Management Unit website, which is also the website that the award was posted to. The deadline for submission is October 9th, which is Friday, October 9th, 2020. And I know in a few spots in the NOFO we missed, and it says Tuesday, October 9th, 2020. It should say Friday, October 9th, 2020. That is the due date by 5 p.m. And the evaluation period will be October, and we hope that the announcement of awards will go out in October or early November. And again, the performance period will be July 1, 2020 through September 30th, 2021. Application instructions. So the application should be in Arial 11-point font, single space, 1-inch margins, and all pages, including attachments, must have the applicant's name at the bottom of the page. And when we sent it out and when we posted it, we have an application that is PDF fillable document. If you are having trouble with that, just let us know. So here is the scoring matrix. The application, you have to complete that, but it's not worth any points. But if you don't complete it, your application won't be considered. And then there's the project narrative, which is worth 80 points. The budget, which is worth 20 points. The agency self-assessment, which is worth 10 points. And your past performance with the DCFS GMU, which is worth 50 points, for a total of 160 points. And we'll go over each of these sections more specifically. So the application, which is worth no points, you have to complete the application form and add a brief narrative in the areas next to the checkboxes where applicable. So for example, it says geographic area served, and it'll say, you know, you can check statewide or region. If you check county or city, you need to put in the box next to it the county or city that you serve, not just check one of the boxes, but actually put where you serve. Victim population to be served, you want to put in the box next to the option you check which population specifically you're serving, write a little bit in there. Include copies of any subcontracts, include resumes of key personnel, and please list your agency's funding as it shows fiscal stability. So if you don't put any other funding sources there, we think that FVPSA could be your only funding source. And often we'll get that, and we know we've given other awards to the agency, but not all the reviewers will know all the awards. So it just helps your application if you put all the funding sources you have there, so that people reviewing your application will know that. And then please remember to sign this form. So the narrative section is worth 80 points. and it should not exceed 10 pages. So the overview is going to be worth 10 points, statement of need 10 points, services proposed 15 points, ability and accessibility of services 10 points, goals and objectives 15 points, and methods of accomplishment 10 points, community coordination and collaboration 10 points. So in the narrative overview, you want to make sure that you answer all three of these questions. So you want to introduce the applicant organization and its role in providing services, including any subcontractors as necessary. And again, even if we may be very familiar with you, you want to really do a good job introducing this, because the people reviewing your application might not be as familiar as the victim service unit. So you really want to make sure that you explain it in there, as that's the only place that we can judge that section for scoring on. Provide up to 3 brief examples of the organization's successes and describe the agency's desired goals and outcomes with service numbers. So please remember to put service numbers in there. And if you've been a provider before, you should have those from your program reports. But yeah, it's important to put service numbers in your goals and outcomes. Narrative statement of need. So you need to make sure you answer both these sections, these 2 questions in there, to establish the degree of need for FVPSA services within the geographic area, and identify the targeted population and explain how the targeted population would benefit from the proposed project. This section should have data in it, and there's data available. So if you don't have your own data on this, you can search and you should be able to find some reputable resources online for those to put data in there. Narrative section with services proposed. Again, you want to make sure you cover all 4 of these sections. Identify what services you will be providing and how the clients are referred to your agency. Explain how your agency will ensure that services are accessible to all populations, how the needs of your clients will be assessed, and how services will be individualized. Describe your agency's approach to direct services delivery and how it meets the needs of the client. And if you're already providing the proposed services in the community, indicate whether there is a waiting list for the proposed service and provide the average length of waiting list and the number of prospective clients on the list. It should be constructed with evidence-supported justification and empirically supported methods, appropriate staffing, flexible design, and clear strategy. So you want to make sure these things make sense. So if you say that you're going to provide case management services to all those in your shelter, and then you don't have any case managers on your budget, you should maybe put in there how you're funding those, or if there's a volunteer, so that it makes sense how those are going to be provided. Availability and accessibility of services. So details on availability of services within the organization geographic areas. So you want to put whether you're the only services there, what other services are there, and there should be other services even if they're not domestic violence shelters or services. So make sure that you're writing in that section what services are available and who you would be connecting clients or individuals with. And then identify organizations providing similar services and describe why duplication of services is warranted. So if there are other agencies providing those services, talk about that. Describe resources or planning that supports sustainability, including diverse funding resources, community commitment, and longevity of the organization. So you want to make sure you address all those things. The next section is goals and objectives. And this is the section where you'll fill out that scope of work table. And we just wanted to take a minute to talk about the difference between goals, objectives, and activities, because this is where a lot of people get confused. So a goal is a broad statement about what the program or initiative intends to accomplish. An objective is an expected achievement that are SMART. So we'll talk about what that SMART means for those objectives and derive from the goal. So everything should fit with each other. So you should have a goal said. It's completely unrelated to the objectives and activities you list. So the activities should be listed to the linked to the objectives, which should be linked to the goals. So they should all be related to each other. If they're not related to each other, maybe you need to have two goals and have goals that are more related to those objectives. Maybe you need to split them out into more so that they relate. And then activities are efforts conducted to achieve the objectives. So that's the actual things you're going to be doing. So a scope of work goal should match with the other sections of your narrative. So it should be related to the other things you've already talked about. It shouldn't just be out of left field. It should be related to the things that have come before it that you've talked about that you want to do. And it should match with your budget. So when we get to the budget part, make sure that these scope of work goals match with what you're putting in your budget and that they make sense together. And it should start with an action word if it's a goal. So goals are usually to provide something, to increase something, to improve something. So there should be some kind of action word to start that goal or as part of that goal. And it should state the target population in that goal. So the objective should be SMART, and that means SMART is the acronym for specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound. And sometimes you'll hear SMART as different, like sometimes the R is a different or the A is different, but specific, you want to make sure your goals are focused and identify a tangible outcome. Measurable, you want to make sure you should have some clear definitions of success. So you should include some type of number so that your objective is a SMART objective. It needs to be measurable and have a number. That's how we'll know if you achieved it. And it should be achievable. So it should be within your power to accomplish it. So if you provided shelter last year for 200 individuals, it probably wouldn't be achievable to put that you're going to provide shelter for 2,000 individuals. I don't know, maybe your growth plan is great, but it should be achievable. Relevant, does it relate to your goal, to your overall narrative and your budget? So it needs to be relevant. So you can have a really good objective, but if it doesn't connect to anything else, it'll seem out of place and it won't really flow. And time bound, it does not need to be in the goal as we have a column for this in the due date, but you should think about how often you're going to be checking your progress on this. And it'll probably be quarterly, as that's when we request the program reports be turned in, but it could be something different. So you really want to think about that as you're filling out that table. And this is what that table looks like. So for the activities, you want a set of tasks that accomplish that objective, and think about the things you'll need to do to accomplish that objective, and list as many things as needed. You can have more than one activity for each objective, just like you can have more than one objective for each goal. And you can have more than one goal for your program. And I know that the form has a spot for 2 goals, but if you need to have more goals, you can add that. Documentation needed, that column. You want to think about what records or backup you are going to have and keep to show your progress towards completing the activities and to show that you did do those activities. So if we do a monitoring, you can show, yeah, we said we did this many services, and this is how you can see that we actually did that. And then how will this goal be measured? So this is for your outcome. So you want to think about quantitatively, how will we know if you achieved this objective? So methods of accomplishment. Describe the plan to achieve the outlined goals and objectives. Include how, who, where, and when these goals and objectives will be achieved. So this is a more narrative version of that table, and you want to explain what measurements will be used to report on the program's success. So this should be a narrative version, so writing out pretty much what you put in that table, it should match. It might have more details because it's narrative, but it should match what was put in that table. Community coordination and collaboration, you want to make sure you answer all 3 of these questions. Identify existing or proposed collaborators for the project and the level of participation of all agencies included in the collaboration. Describe how the program will encourage the collaborative efforts of various agencies or organizations by working with existing programs or forming new partnerships to provide the proposed service. and include any current memorandums of understandings or letters of intent in your application packet. So if you say that you're working with an agency and you have an MOU or a LOI, it's great to include those in your application. You should include those. And then the budget is worth 20 points, and 10 points of that comes from the proposed project budget, and 10 points comes from the budget narrative. And this is the proposed project budget. You will fill this out, and it should match your budget narrative and your project narrative. If you say you're going to provide emergency shelter and you don't have any personnel costs, that should be explained in section B narrative. So you should say that you run off volunteers, or you should say that you have another funding stream that pays the personnel, but you need these funds to pay for this part of it. It should make sense. You will be scored on if this seems realistic on your proposed scope of work. So if it needs to make sense with the other items on your application. So you just need to make sure that there's that connection. Budget narrative, personnel. So we go into detail of what counts in each section. So in the personnel section, that's going to be employees who provide direct services. You're going to identify them there. And I'll show you what that table looks like. It's going to be that Excel document that's up on our website that you'll want to fill out for this. The NOFO has a table that helps you distinguish if an employee is employee or if they're a contract staff. You should really want to look at that because it does make a difference in where you put them in your budget. And list each position and the employee name if known, if they're going into personnel. If it's someone you have to hire, you can put to be determined or will be hired or whatever you want to indicate that. And provide a breakdown of the wages or salary and their fringe benefit rate, which is healthcare and FICA, etc. Make sure you put in the job description and explain how the position provides direct services, because personnel can only be for those positions paying or providing direct services in the time they're providing direct services. For other, that'll go into your indirect costs. So make sure that that's explained in there. Yeah, and so the last bullet says only those staff whose time can be traced directly back to the grant project should be included in this budget category. So if you have other funding streams and other things that people are working on, you want to make sure that that's tracked and that the budget shows what percentage they're working on to fit the grant that you're applying for. All others should be considered part of the applicant's indirect costs. So you'll put all administrative type jobs and non-direct service personnel in the indirect costs. So here's what it looks like. You can see there's sections to put employees, and you can add rows if you have more than 4 people you're requesting funds for. So just please remember to, at the top of the budget narrative form, put your agency's name, and then to fill out these sections completely. It'll help your application. Travel costs must provide direct benefit to this project, and you have to identify the staff that will travel, the purpose, the frequency, and the projected cost. And it can exceed the U.S. General Service Administration or GSA rate. And so you can look those up online if you don't know them. I think there's a link to look them up in the NOFO. If you can't find that, let us know. We can send you that link. Training needs to identify and justify any training costs specifically associated with the project, including the type of training, location, number attending, and the benefit to the project. And that's that section. And so you want to really make sure that you fill out the justification. We see that people forget to fill out the justification often. So make sure you fill out those 2 yellow sections that are the justifications. Budget narrative operates. So this is where you'll list tangible and expendable property like office supplies, program supplies. General supplies do not need to be priced individually, but a list of typical program supplies is necessary. If food is to be purchased for shelters, details must be provided that explain how food will be utilized to meet the project goal. And we can't provide or pay for food for staff. It's only food for victims. So operating, here's that section, you'll fill that out. This is where rent, utilities, phone, all those things go. And you want to make sure you cost allocate them. If you have multiple grants, you want to divide the percentage by the percentage that this grant will represent in the budget so that it is divided. List equipment to purchase in the equipment area. So that'll be or lease costing $5,000 or more, and justify these expenditures. And you're going to list any electronics regardless of cost. So tablets, computers, cell phones, those will all be listed here in equipment regardless of cost. And then any big equipment or lease costing $5,000 or more will be listed here. And equipment that does not directly facilitate the purpose of a project as an integral component is not allowed. And equipment purchased for this project must be labeled, inventoried, and tracked as such. So here's the equipment section, what it looks like on the Excel sheet. And here's the contractual consultant services. Those are project workers who are non-employees of the applicant's organization, and they should be identified there. And any costs associated with these workers, like travel, and you should explain the need or purpose and identify and justify these costs. And also, if you're putting any of these in your application, you need to provide a copy of the written agreement with all partners. So you need to remember to provide that to us with your application. So here's what that section looks like. Please remember to fill in that justification line in the middle there. That often gets missed, and method accountability. So just make sure you're really filling out each section of this. And if you have questions, you can always email us or contact us, and we can provide answers, and we'll put those up on the website. This can, other expenses, that section should include things like audit costs, car insurance, client transportation, or anything that just doesn't fit in other categories would go in other expenses. And this is what that looks like, and make sure that if it's something like printer services, those things are all cost allocated, like your audit, that should be cost allocated. So remember, all these things should be cost allocated based on the grants that you are receiving. Indirect costs. So this represents the expense of doing business that are not readily identified or allocable to a specific grant, contract, project, function, or activity, but are necessary for the general operation of the organization. Subrecipients without a negotiated indirect rate with their cognizant federal agency must use a 10% de minimis rate. So your cognizant federal agency is the agency you're receiving the most funding from. I learned that in a recent training. But if you don't have a negotiated rate, you can use the 10% de minimis rate. If you do have a currently federally approved indirect rate with your federal cognizant agency, you must include a copy of the negotiated indirect agreement with this application. It's really important for us to know that, so that we can, when we're doing the award and then the notice of the NOSAB, the notice of subawards, that we have the correct indirect rate. And then it's also important that you fill out the section. You don't just put a number of what your indirect costs are going to be, that you fill out what those indirect costs are going to be. So you want to put what you think those costs are going to be, whether it's administrative personnel or just whatever types of services you're thinking you're going to charge to the indirect. So in addition to filling out that first tab, which was all those things we just went over, you want to make sure you click on the second tab and fill out Form 2. And column B should automatically update with what you entered in Form 1. So what you put on that first form of what your budget for the application is, that should automatically fill in column B of that form. But then you need to complete column C through G with the for all other funding sources for this project, not for your agency, but for this project. So if you're applying for shelter and the shelter has other funding streams, you want to put that in column C through G. Don't forget to include an explanation of any funding sources you list as pending. And the match column will automatically update once you have completed Form 3. So After you finish Form 2, which I'm going to show you in a minute, you want to make sure you also do the third tab and fill out Form 3. So this is what Form 2 looks like, and you'll see that GMU column. That will automatically populate with the numbers you put for your budget proposal on Form 1. And then you'll fill out these other ones that say other funding. You'll type in what that funding is, where it says other funding. You'll type in VOCA or marriage license or whatever other funding source you have, and then put pending or secured, and then the amount. And then you'll break up those expenses by the expense category, and it should add everything for you. So Form 3 looks just like Form 1, so we're not going to look at all the sections of that, but it's for your match. And your match is 20% of your total award. So again, to calculate that, we already talked about that. You take the amount that you're asking for and divide by 0.8, and then multiply by 0.2. And so that'll tell you how much money you have to put in those sections for your match to add up to. All funds designated as match are restricted to the same uses as the sub-award funds and must be expended within the grant period. So match can be non-federal funding, donations, or volunteers. And if you think you put your match and you end up having more volunteers or more donations than you thought, it's the only section that can be changed without a budget modification once your award is going. But we want you to put where you predict that you're going to have your match, because you should have a plan for how you're going to meet these match requirements if you're applying for the funding. So section D is the self-assessment. It's worth 10 points. And you want to make sure you complete all the self-assessment questionnaires for your organization and answer all the questions. So just make sure you go through and don't skip any of the questions. There's not much detail on that section, so just really answer all the questions. And that's really what we're going to be looking at, is the completeness of it. And then section E is past performance with the GMU, and that's worth 50 points. And for this section, you need to submit your most recent single audit or financial opinion. So you're going to want to submit that with your application. And do not attach our most recent subrecipient monitoring. We will use that, but we have those, so you don't need to submit those with your application. And new applicants will only receive a score for the single audit or financial opinion. So really make sure if you're a new agency, new applicant, that you include that. Submission instructions. So the grant application deadline is Friday, October 9th at 5 p.m. The signed completed application in PDF form, documents with any of the required attachments as that PDF document. You should scan them all together and make it one document. You should send that to the DCFS grants at dcfs.nv.gov email. If for some reason it's too big, you can do it as multiple emails, but just make sure in the subject line you let us know. So the subject line should read FVPSA NOFO response from and your agency's name. If for some reason the PDF was too big and you need to send it as multiple, say 1 of 3 and then 2 of 3 and 3 of 3, so that we know we're getting multiple parts. But if you're just sending one, you just want it to say FVPSA NOFO response from and your agency name. If you do not receive an email acknowledgement within 3 business days of submitting your application, please email us to verify the receipt of it. So you want to make sure we got it, that something didn't go haywire with the email. So we will respond to everybody who applies that we received their application. So you should receive a response within 3 business days. If you don't, please check with us. Later incomplete applications will not be scored or considered for funding, so make sure that your application is on time and complete. And once the application is submitted, no corrections or adjustments may be made prior to the negotiation period. So a few application tips. Please use the checklist. It's there to help you. It's a good tool. Don't just check through it. Make sure you read it and that you're checking, when you check the box, that you actually have considered that item and included it if it's needed. Make sure all sections are complete and make sure all attachments are included, and don't wait till the last minute to submit, because we all know that when we wait till the last minute to do something, that's when our computer decides to go haywire or our internet crashes. So just the earlier you can submit it, the better. Then you don't have to stress any of those technical issues that might happen if you wait to the last minute. So the evaluation process, once we get it, we will do a technical review, and the DCFS staff will perform a technical review to make sure each applicant meets the minimal standards, and that applicants may be disqualified if they're missing fundamental elements or if they're a type of agency that doesn't qualify for the fund. Application, and then step 2 is the application review panel, which each applicant that passes the technical review will be evaluated for content and scored by at least 2 review panel members using the GMU scoring matrix. During the review process, staff will identify strengths and weaknesses and may recommend that the application be funded or not funded or partially funded. Specific revisions are made to the budget or scope of work, or special conditions are placed on the award. Examples could be certain fiscal controls or more stringent performance requirements or more frequent reviews. The review panel will identify specific line items for revision if funding limitations result in a reduction of the overall proposed budget. In the event that the budget reductions are necessary, an equitable formula based on application ranking and scores will be developed and applied in an impartial manner. Decisions will be based on the GMU and the review panel recommendations, which will be provided to the administrator of the DCFS or the designee for the final approval. And then step 3 is the final decision. And a successful applicant is not guaranteed you will receive all or partial funding for the program, or if initially funded, that your project will receive continued funding in subsequent grant cycles. But those funding decisions, will issue them, and we're going to try to issue more feedback on how what the strengths and opportunities for improvement on your application work, because I know in the past we haven't given much feedback on why applications were or were not funded, and how you can improve for subsequent years in your application. So funding decisions will be based on the following factors: review panel scores, geographic distribution of the proposed grant awards, federal priority funding populations, and conflicts or redundancies with other funded programs or subplanting of existing funding. And I'm not going to go over subplanting, but if for some reason you need to know what that is, please contact us. Post-award requirements. So after you get the award, you'll be required to submit monthly financial status and request for reimbursement or RFR workbooks, performance reports, and there are the dates that those performance reports are due. Once you're awarded and we have a final agreement, we will send out those reporting workbooks, and you'll be required to participate in subrecipient monitoring. So additional post-award requirements are compliance with any changes to federal or state laws, registration with Nevada 211, and the client grievance process. And if you have any questions, general questions, should go to the DCFS grants inbox. That's the best way to reach us all. We can all check that. But here's our individual contact information also. And now questions. And sorry I didn't leave as much time to make sure we've answered all questions before we end. And this is recorded, so if you can't stay on past 3:30, you can always check the recording once it's posted to get the answers. So Jean, I've seen a lot of questions come into the chat box. Would you mind asking me those questions so we can get them answered?
For sure. So the first one was the budget should be written for 15 months, not 12 months, correct? Since it is being extended to the end of September?
Correct. Especially if you're planning on back billing for July, August, and September if you're awarded. If you have an existing FVPSA award that you extended and you're not planning on back billing, or you didn't expend any money because you didn't know if you would be awarded, you can always do the budget for 12 months and write in there that you will start your budget October 1st. Since I know it's very hard on some agencies, if they don't know whether or not they're funded. So does that make sense?
And that just answered the second question. Yes.
Oh, okay.
We answered both of, the second question was if our current FVPSA grant was extended, can we create a budget for 12 months? So thank you for doing that. And then how does an agency access the Nevada Coalition to End Domestic and Sexual Violence grievance procedure to make sure our agency is aligned prior to applying?
I don't know that answer. I could reach out to them unless, Jean, do you know that answer?
I believe you can look on their website or send them a quick little email. They're pretty helpful to share their information with agencies, but we can double check with them. And that'll be posted with our frequently asked question page. The next question is, in the NOFO, it says to copy and paste the budget narrative into the application. The Excel sheets are landscape and the application is portrait. Should we change the orientation of the Excel before copying and pasting into the application?
You should make sure it's all visible. The way I do that is I copy and I paste it, and then I click on what I've pasted and I say fit to window, and it usually resizes it. If you put it in portrait and it resizes it, then that works too. You just want to make sure all the information is on there. And then you can also, which I didn't say, but it is always great, attach the Excel sheet also in addition to the copy and pasted PDF with your budget. We have to have it in the PDF because then we can't change it and it shows what was originally submitted. But it is useful to have the Excel sheet that you sent if there's questions. Would you agree with that, Jean?
Yes. Okay, in the application, do you want us to list key personnel, like other than on the budget narrative? So should we only list the personnel to be funded with FVPSA or all the personnel? For example, this particular agency has 6 employees, but only half would be paid through FVPSA. Would they list all of the employees or just the 3 being paid by FVPSA?
I think this has been done inconsistently in the past, and I don't think we've ever had clear guidance on this. I would just list the ones funded by FVPSA because I can imagine some large agencies, it might become a challenge to list all the key personnel. And really, we're just going to be looking at the key personnel that are asked to be funded through FVPSA are their resumes are provided. So that's one of the main things we use that section for. You do want to include anybody that you're going to bill in indirect costs also. So you want to include the people who are in the personnel and then the people who are in the indirect costs.
Okay, thank you. And then if an audit can be placed within the other category, can an agency's general bookkeeping costs also be placed in other? And then if so, what if the bookkeeper is a contracted employee, someone that they use from an outside agency?
Jean, do you know the answer to this one off the top of your head?
Okay, so because the audit is a requirement by the feds to have for federal funding, that is why you're allowed to have that in the other category. Bookkeepers are considered somebody that's helping your agency with indirect services, so they're not directly seeing clients or helping with client services, so they would be considered an indirect cost. So any bookkeeping services, regardless of contract or uncontracted employee, would be considered indirect.
Thank you.
Okay, you're welcome. So that answers all the questions that popped in. If anybody has any right now, we'll just go ahead and either go ahead and type them in the chat box, and we'll go ahead and we'll answer them just as quick as we can. Give you just a couple minutes to type in and share some questions if you have them.
if you think of a question later, please email it to the DCFS grants inbox. If you have it, I'm sure other agencies have it, and we would love to answer it for you and put it on our frequently asked questions document. And like I said, our goal is to get that up by the end of the week, but if you send us questions, you know, as they come up this week or the rest of this week and early next week, we should be able to get them on there.
And just so you guys all know, any questions remain confidential. We don't share agency-specific information when the questions pop up or when we post them on our facts. So if you have a really crazy question that you're kind of embarrassed to ask, just go ahead and ask it to us. We're happy to answer it, and we will definitely maintain confidentiality for who's asking what question. But thank you guys so much for attending this training. It doesn't look like we have any more questions at this time. So we're going to go ahead and log off, and we appreciate your time and attention. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.